Oh, hi. I'm back. Hooray, we did it. So my name is Fluin. I'm a developer advocate on the Angular team at Google. So earlier today, you saw awesome things about being productive, about being practical, real advice that you can go home and act on. This talk is not that. Okay, so there's two warnings. So first, all of this is kind of more at the early ideation phase, right? This is not real products. These are not things that you're going to go home, open up VS Code, and start typing. Second, I'm going to not use very precise language. And that's intentional because we want to really figure out what these things mean to other people and not just us. And so today I want to introduce the idea of Angular for designers. And so I think first off, it's really important to start talking a little bit about maybe a definition of designer. So I'm not going to be very specific here, just like I said. So when I talk about designers, I'm focusing more on individuals who are more on the user interface and user experience side of things. And so a lot of designers define themselves in different ways. Some people are UX engineers. Some people live in Photoshop all day. Some people live in Creative Express. There's lots and lots of tools, lots of different workflows. And I don't want to single out any of those individual workflows because a lot of these individuals and a lot of the people in the room are very multi-talented. And so you might have a developer who's also a designer. So please forgive the imprecise language that I'm going to use to try and introduce these topics. We want to hear what people think and what people say, and then we'll kind of refine these things over time. So my goals today are twofold. First, we want to share that we care about designers. This is something that I think needs to be said because if you don't say it, nobody knows. And so second, I really want to start a conversation. And so I'm going to throw out a few kind of initial ideas and some of the things that we've been working on. But then I really do have a success criteria for this talk of people sending us messages, letting us know what they think, letting us know what tools they're working on. And so at the end, definitely reach out to me. So I'm going to go through this in 4 sections. First, I want to acknowledge some of the legacy that exists in terms of Angular and AngularJS for designers, and I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that they face and the challenges that we face today. Then I want to go into some of the initial goals that we have set out for this initiative of Angular for designers. And then I'm going to go into a few of these initiatives and say, hey, wouldn't it be cool if X existed? And then those are things that we want your feedback on. And then last, I'll give you some specific instructions for getting involved. So let's get started. So I first want to acknowledge some of the legacy. So many of us come from an AngularJS background. Not all of us, but many of us did. And there was kind of a magic in the AngularJS world where you could just start changing applications very quickly, and it made it really great for prototyping. Additionally, when we look at the current workflow between designers and developers in larger teams, there's a handoff of these interactive prototypes, of these things that we're building using Sketch, using all these other great tools that we want to look at and really explore a little bit more. And then lastly, one of the challenges that we face is gaining adoption of our design systems. And so we talked earlier about how everyone kind of needs one, everyone has one, but it's still sometimes a challenge in terms of getting people to developers to build things in the right way that the design system intended. So I talked a little bit about the magic of AngularJS, and I kind of always come back to this angularjs.org homepage. So how many people here, their first exposure to AngularJS was this page, and you're like, you typed something in the box, and it just showed up magically, right? That was really cool. In particular, because I was taking things that I already knew, HTML, and I was making small, kind of microscopic changes to that HTML, and it was manifesting as behaviors. It was manifesting itself as functionality, which then I could then use to show someone. I could show a concept. I could say, hey, what if it did this? And that was something that was really helpful for designers that were building out prototypes. And so for those designers that do know HTML, AngularJS was really exciting for this prototyping use case because you could add dashes of interactivity throughout your application, throughout your kind of static mockup in some ways. But we've actually made this much harder today. So in terms of if we compare AngularJS and Angular, Angular is much better at helping you build a scaled, maintainable application in the right way that's going to continue to grow and work well for you and deliver great user experiences. But along with that came a lot of tooling. I have to install Node. Wait, this might sound easy to some of us. For a lot of people, installing Node is actually non-trivial, right? Like some people go through NVM, some people install it bare. Some people execute curl scripts that execute arbitrary code off the internet, which is a little dangerous. Maybe don't do that. Some people, like sometimes, like it didn't used to, but now NPM comes with Node. But what if you're in a jurisdiction where, for example, you need to use an alternative? You have to use something that's maybe NPM's blocked for you, and you have to use something like CNPM. That's a challenge that you have to then overcome. Then we have all the tooling that we have for sharing and collaborating as developers, right? So a lot of us really love Git. Git is very, very powerful in terms of the way that it can help you understand and merge changes to source code. It's not as well designed for merging creative things like PSDs, right? Then there's Angular CLI. It's really powerful, it's really awesome, and I think a lot of us in the room are going to continue using it to achieve these really great outcomes and save ourselves a lot of time. But for a designer, this is another tool that they have to go learn that they might not already have in their toolbox, they might not want in their toolbox. TypeScript is another example. So a lot of people, when they hear about Angular and TypeScript and how we use it in all of our examples, they think, oh, I have to go learn another language, right? We all know that it's not another language, but this is yet another barrier. And then lastly, if you look at the experience of creating a new project, so if I run ng-new, I'm going to get a very scalable, maintainable project with things like tests and unit tests and end-to-end, which are good for developers, but they actually get in the way if I'm trying to just prototype something out or move quickly in terms of just manifesting an experience that's not actually going to be used in production. There's a really common team pattern where we'll see that designers, they build something, they build either a specification file or an interactive prototype, and then they hand that off to a developer, right? It's a one-time handoff, or it starts that way. But then very, very quickly, they want to do revisions, we need to collaborate. How many people have seen something like profile screen 3, final 2, final, super final, right? This is Git for designers. And so this is one of the kind of big challenges as we think about how do we collaborate better because we've got these multiple sources of truth. We also hear from a lot of designers, my design was perfect, and then the developers, they ruined it. How could they? They didn't understand what I was trying to create, and they kept doing this thing called reality, right? Like, oh, the platform doesn't support that. But that's not what users need, right? The users need experiences. They don't need technology. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the goals of this initiative, Angular for Designers. So first, I think we should spend a lot of time focusing on making Angular useful for designers. Just first focusing on those that know HTML and CSS. So if you think back to the AngularJS use case of why that was so exciting and why I think it brought so many kind of web designers into the world of Angular and AngularJS, it was because it was so easy to get started. And so that's one of the goals. And we also want to kind of create some of the magic, because there is a degree of magic when you can just start sprinkling in that functionality. Second, we want to create more collaborative teams. And so I talked about this handoff that's really a big challenge. And so one of the things we think a lot about, and we spent a lot of time talking about, is this idea of, could there be a single source of truth that exists between designers and developers, so that when they make modifications, whether it's from the coding standpoint or from the design standpoint, if we're modifying the same document, that's going to be helpful. And so we really want to bridge the gaps between these roles in terms of skill sets, in terms of access to tooling. And so if we reanalyze this picture, instead of having a designer that hands off to a developer, what if they're working together in a single document? Third, I want to think about empowering design system authors. So if you have a design system and it's a manifestation of your brand, which is really important, every time you have a product team go off and build something that doesn't look like your standards, your brand is actually going to be suffering a little bit, right? It's going to not feel as cohesive. Customers will not have the same positive associations with the brand. And so that's actually one of the goals, is how do we empower these design system authors to then engage developers more effectively. Fourth, really making it easier to build these great experiences. And so if you're, from the development standpoint, if we can make it easy for you to be building these things out faster and give you best practices from a design standpoint, not just a development standpoint out of the box, again, you're going to be manifesting better experiences for your users. And so now I want to dive into a set of initiatives where we've been doing a lot of thinking about this. We've been having several kind of early conversations. And so there's several directions this can go, and I want to explore these collaboratively with you. So this is a disclaimer. Many of these efforts are not real. If you see something and you're like, oh, that's cool, I can't wait till that comes out, you have to tell us. Otherwise, we won't know that we need to go build these things or have the community build them. So these are not promises. Does everyone agree? They're not promises? All right, good. All right, so make Angular useful for designers. What if we had less developer tooling needed in order to get in and make a change to an existing Angular application? So I want to highlight StackBlitz here as something that's already exists today that actually facilitates this. So if I'm a designer and I know a little bit of HTML and I want to get in and modify an Angular application, StackBlitz is kind of amazing, right? I can pull up a single URL that corresponds to our GitHub page. I don't need to install a command line. I don't need to install Node. I don't need NPM. I don't even need to learn the Angular CLI. I just pull up a URL, and I can look at an HTML file, start making changes, and immediately see exactly how that's going to manifest itself on the page. And so this is kind of where that magic comes in, is how do we have a single source of truth, and if that source of truth could be the application, that's actually a pretty big win. So this is something that does not exist, but something that I've talked about a little bit before. I call it ng.exe. Just for the idea that this is a binary that we could theoretically put on your machine, or you could download from the internet, where we statically link NPM, we statically link Node, and give you the ability to start getting up and running with Angular and the Angular CLI much quicker. Right? If you didn't have to install those extra steps, I think this would be a really powerful thing, because then I don't have to go and learn all that extra tooling and deal with versions and all these things. We can just trust the Angular team, theoretically, to be providing these things for us. So again, in making Angular useful for designers, what if we had some more ergonomic file formats? So imagine simpler components. And so I was actually really surprised by this when I started digging into this initiative, because I was talking to designer after designer, and they were saying, this idea that you have a TypeScript file, you have an HTML file, and a CSS file separate, and then a spec file, because they're typically using the CLI, that can actually be somewhat confusing for them. If they could have all of these things in a single file, that's actually a preference, right? From a development standpoint, it's technically the same, right? Whether you have 3 files or 1. But even just having this slight, subtle change of being able to specify all 3 of these pieces in a single file would actually make a huge deal, not only to the perception, but also to the productivity of designers. One of the examples I was given of this is, in Angular, if you want to copy a component, what do, right? You take the file, and the other file, and the other file, and you copy them all. And then you have to go and add the new, you have to rename everything, and then you add the new reference into your ng module. That doesn't necessarily match what people are expecting out of the box in order to create a new component, right? They're used to saying, hey, I've got one thing, make a copy of it, now I've got 2. And it doesn't quite match that. And so if we had this idea of a single component in a single HTML file, that would really better match a lot of those expectations and meet those needs. I want you to now imagine a new ng-add command. So we talked a little bit about ng-add in the first keynote, where this is really adding capabilities to an application. But what if, by adding those capabilities, you need to remove something from the project? And so what if you ng-newed a new project, and then you could ng-add at Angular/prototype? So that would theoretically set up an Angular CLI project, and then remove all of the things that designers don't care about. So things like tests. I know, right? This is a little contradictory with this morning. But when you're building for a specific purpose, which is manifesting and evaluating a design or an experience, trying to also have it be production code at the same time can be a challenge. One of the things that we do a lot at Google, and we've heard from a lot of other companies that they do, is people build prototypes not to help even developers, but to validate an idea, right? This is a product management effort in a lot of ways, where I want to take this prototype that feels like an experience, and I want to put that in front of our users, and we want to do research, and we want to evaluate how do people react to this experience. And for those sorts of experiences, tests are less important. I also want to imagine an Angular I/O where it's Angular I/O/design. So all of the getting started content and all of the content all the way across Angular I/O is really focused on developers. We have the expectation you're going to go learn Node, you're going to go learn JavaScript, you're going to have all of this common understanding that a lot of developers in Angular have today. But we could rearrange that. We could have a specific section focused on, hey, what do I need to get my job done? My job of focusing on prototyping, focusing on building out experiences in a way that really just applies to me. So what are the best practices that should exist for designers? How do I get started, right? Is Tour of Heroes the best way for a designer to get started? Maybe not. And then really focusing in the instructions on the things that these people care about. So the second goal that we had was creating more collaborative teams. And one of the ways that we think about this is giving prototypers access to real functionality. And there's several ways that we can look at doing that. One of them is actually already out in kind of the wild. So if anybody uses Sketch, or it's a tool used by a lot of designers, using a tool called Storybook, you can actually load, they have a plugin where you can load real components in Sketch. And so this is actually a really cool idea that I think would be very powerful, because if you don't do this, if you have two sources of truth where, for example, you're building out a component library and then you're also building out a corresponding set of Sketch components, you have this slightly uncanny valley where the Sketch components have to be maintained in isolation from the components in your application. And if they differ, that creates problems. It creates different expectations between the designers and the developers. And there's a tool that we've actually been using in Google that it's being built out right now that we're planning on externalizing at some point in the future. I won't even try and put a date on it. But internally, it's called CloudKit today. And so it's a cloud-based prototyping tool that uses real components. And so the idea is that you can create, visually here, a set of components on a screen in a hierarchy, and then you can apply all of the rules and kind of have the rails from that component hierarchy and that component library so that designers can't do things that can't happen in the real world. Then they can create and share these experiences. You can use it for UX research, and all of the experiences are real components running in the browser, being bootstrapped at runtime. The other really magical thing about this is that all of these things can be backed up to by real data. So imagine if, when you're showing a grid, you could hook that up to a Google spreadsheet, or you could hook that up to some sort of data source that helps you visualize this content without having to go and build it all out. So all of these things are really useful, not only for designers, but as I mentioned, product managers, where, hey, maybe I want to create an interface and start a conversation about a feature that we could offer. Right? Having a cloud-based prototyping tool that gives you real components and real experiences would be very, very powerful. And so this is something we're working on right now, working with a separate team within the Google Cloud Platform team to try and make sure that that's externalized and available for all developers. And one of the pieces of that is really simplifying the process for designers to contribute. So designers really benefit from this idea of Angular's advancements. So I talked about how a lot of these things like Node can be very difficult to get started with. But if we can make all of those things simpler, if we make Angular simpler, designers are going to benefit from that as well. There's also a very cool app out there that's really just getting started called PageDraw. And they have a bit of a controversial opinion about, hey, what if designers were building dumb presentational components purely in a visual editor, and then we manifest those as Angular components that developers can then hook up events, state, and then consume, right? So all the developer has to worry about is let me wire up the data, let me handle all the events, and then the designer can focus on building out the dumb presentational components that really create the screen. And so they have, this exists today, you can try them out, so that you can create artboards which correspond to components. There's reusable components, you can nest them. There's even things like state, you can bind to variables that are coming in as inputs to your components. And very recently they launched in kind of a beta form some of their initial Angular support. So number 3 was about really empowering design system authors. And so there's a really cool tool out there called Compodoc. How many people have heard of Compodoc? Awesome. So what it does is it creates a demo site, a documentation and demo site of a component library based on JS doc annotations. And so one of the things we've been exploring with the folks on the CloudKit team is what if we could repurpose those same annotations and make any component library loadable into that cloud prototyping tool. So you add one set of additional metadata that's useful for users of your design system, and then we also get to be able to take advantage of that as part of the prototyping process. And so we think this idea of a defined set of metadata that everyone can start adding to their components is going to really kind of help the secondary users of all these component libraries. I also want to explore the idea of just the things that we have today in terms of adding material design to your application via ng-add and generate. Right? If every component library out there adds their component library via ng-add, that makes it much, much easier for developers to opt in and take advantage of these things, which we think will be really, really powerful in terms of increasing adherence to these design systems, as long as it's easy. So we're also really focused on making it easier to build great experiences. So you've heard about Ivy, you've heard about CLI, you've heard about StackBlitz, but there's actually things that the Angular team has done for ourselves that we feel like helps it make it a much more collaborative process. And so every PR in the Angular repo that is originated by an Angular team member or touched by an Angular team member can basically get this preview. So it's a bot called Mary Poppins. And what happens is we actually spin up a fully functional version of our site based on the PR before it's merged, before anyone's taken a look at that. And the power there is, imagine if your designers could say, hey, I want to make this change, they could get out a fully rendered preview version and understand what that impact would have on the real application. And so this is about removing those barriers and the handoffs if we can all collaborate better in the single environment. So I want to end with a little bit of information about how to get involved. This is pretty easy. I'm on Twitter, at Stephen Fluin, StephenFluin. And I definitely hope to hear from a lot of you, because this is something that we care about. This is something we're going to be investing time in. And the more input you give us in terms of what you need and what you care about, the more aligned our efforts are going to be to your needs. We're also looking for community contributions, because I think one of the things that's amazing about Angular is we have such a great community. So a lot of us are already working and collaborating with designers. And so if you have patterns, you have tools that are making this process better for you, I'd love to take a look at those and possibly help share those with the world. Thank you so much.